I want to begin with 3 specific data points that should send a genuine chill down the spine of anyone who understands how the global machine actually functions. 12 commercial vessels captured in a single, sweeping maneuver. 40 Russian naval units, simultaneously active across 3 distinct maritime theaters, and $3 billion in Western assets, currently locked down in Russian custody, effectively frozen. Washington is currently expressing outrage. London is convening emergency summits. Brussels is drafting condemnation letters. But here is the uncomfortable truth that nobody in those capitals wants to admit out loud. This was not a sudden, irrational outburst of anger from Moscow. It was not a chaotic accident. It was a coldly calculated strategy, executed with the precision of a scalpel. And the most alarming part of this entire scenario is not that Russia did it. It is that we are the ones who showed them exactly how to do it. Let us look at the reality of what just took place in the freezing waters bordering the Russian Federation. In a move executed with absolute military discipline, Russian naval forces launched simultaneous seizure operations against LNG carriers and oil tankers across the Black Sea, the Baltic approaches, and the critical shipping lanes of the Arctic. These were not Russian ships. These were American-operated vessels and Allied flagships. They have all been detained under legal frameworks so dense and complex that Western maritime lawyers are currently scrambling just to untangle the fine print. The reaction from Western leaders followed the usual script: shock, disbelief, and threats of economic retaliation. But having analyzed foreign policy and great power competition for years, I can tell you that this time, their surprise was genuine. They truly did not believe Russia would cross this line. And frankly, that failure of imagination is far more worrying than the seizures themselves. It proves that our strategic planners completely failed to predict a move that was staring them in the face for 2 years. I need to challenge a fundamental assumption you likely hold about the world. You probably believe that international maritime law is a shield, a neutral force field that protects merchant ships from the quarrels of nations. We are taught that commerce is sacred, that the freedom of navigation is absolute. While those treaties exist on paper, history teaches us a different lesson. Rules only matter if there is a neutral power willing and able to enforce them. When the enforcement mechanism itself is turned into a political weapon, those rules dissolve. They are replaced by the laws of physics, force, leverage, and territory. To understand why these ships are sitting in Russian harbors right now, we have to go back to late 2022. This is the origin point of the current crisis. Following the invasion of Ukraine, the Western Alliance rolled out what they proudly called the most aggressive sanctions package in history. We cut off SWIFT banking access, we froze central bank assets, and we implemented the now infamous oil price cap. The logic in Washington was technocratic and confident. The goal was to keep Russian oil flowing to the global market to prevent a price spike, but to artificially cap the revenue to drain Moscow's war funds. To the U.S. Treasury, this looked like a smart, calibrated precision strike, a way to manage the world utilizing the dominance of the U.S. dollar. But we need to look at this through the eyes of Moscow. To them, it didn't look like a policy, it looked like a declaration of imperial control. The West essentially stood up and told a nuclear power, you can sell your own sovereign resources, but only at the price your enemies decide. And how did we enforce this? We didn't use warships initially, we used insurance. Since 90% of global shipping insurance is handled in London and the West, we leveraged our dominance over logistics and finance. The ultimatum was simple: play by our rules or your ships are uninsurable. If they are uninsurable, they cannot enter major ports. If they cannot enter ports, you go broke. For nearly 2 years, Russia took the hit. They appeared to be cornered. But while Western analysts were celebrating the efficacy of the price cap, Moscow was quietly building a backdoor. They weren't just sitting idle. They were constructing a parallel reality. Between 2022 and 2024, a massive shift occurred in the plumbing of the global economy. Russia aggressively shifted their export focus from Europe to Asia, specifically India and China, but more importantly, they went on a shopping spree. They bought up hundreds of aging tankers destined for the scrapyard, creating the so-called shadow fleet, vessels that operate outside Western insurance protocols, outside Western banking, and outside Western tracking. They built up Arctic shipping capabilities that Western analysts said were technically impossible or economically unviable. They created new financial channels to sidestep the US dollar. These were not just desperate survival tactics. They were preparations for a world where they didn't need Western permission to exist. Then, in late 2024, the situation shifted from preparation to active conflict. The United States and its allies, frustrated that the sanctions were leaking, started physically boarding and inspecting tankers in international waters. They suspected these ships were bypassing the price cap or carrying dual-use technology. The justification was sanctions enforcement. It sounded legal. It sounded bureaucratic. But in practice, economic policy had morphed into physical coercion. We were stopping ships on the high seas. Moscow watched this very closely. They took notes. They documented every boarding, every delay, and every instance where the West asserted authority over neutral commerce. They were building a case file. They were waiting for a precedent. Then, in mid-December, they found their catalyst. An American-operated tanker collided with a Russian research vessel in the northern latitudes. The collision resulted in the tragic deaths of several Russian sailors. While Washington immediately classified it as a tragic maritime accident, Moscow spun a different narrative. They claimed the tanker was a spy ship conducting aggressive maneuvers. They demanded the vessel return to a Russian port for a criminal inquiry. When the ship refused and continued on its course, Russia didn't just issue a diplomatic protest. They labeled the crew as fugitives fleeing the scene of a homicide. And here is where the genius of their legal strategy comes into play. It doesn't actually matter whose version of the story is true. What matters is that Russia built a legal framework to justify what they did next. By treating the incident as a criminal investigation rather than a military event, they created a pretext for policing actions. They weren't attacking Western shipping. They were enforcing maritime law and apprehending suspects. The seizures that followed were not spontaneous. They were a synchronized geopolitical ambush. Russian naval units moved in sync across multiple time zones. They boarded and escorted 12 vessels into their harbors. The crews, hundreds of ordinary commercial sailors from the Philippines, India, Eastern Europe, and the U.S., found their status instantly changed. They are now material witnesses in an ongoing state investigation. They aren't technically hostages. Moscow is very careful not to use that word, but functionally, they have become leverage in a high-stakes standoff they have zero stake in. What Russia is doing here is a tactic called strategic mirroring. They are challenging the bedrock assumption of modern trade that commercial shipping operates in a neutral bubble, insulated from great power conflict. They have shattered this norm by deliberately using the exact playbook the West handed them. The logic they are presenting to the world is brutally simple, and it is difficult for Western diplomats to counter without looking like hypocrites. Their argument is this: if the United States can board tankers to enforce arbitrary price caps in open waters, why can't Russia do the same to enforce security protocols? If Western systems can be weaponized to enforce economic preferences, why can't Russia weaponize its regional military strength to enforce its territorial integrity? This forces Western policymakers to face an uncomfortable reality. Can you really dictate global rules without facing reciprocal vulnerability? The West assumed it had a monopoly on lawfare, the use of law as a weapon of war. Russia has just demonstrated that too can play that game. The human toll is already accumulating. We have families thousands of miles away, in Texas, in Manila, in London, having their lives upended. Their relatives are sitting in cabins in Murmansk and Vladivostok, caught in a legal limbo that could last for months. When commerce becomes a theater of war, it is always ordinary people, the sailors, the engineers, the logistics coordinators, who pay the price first. But if you zoom out, the specific fate of these 12 ships is just the tip of the iceberg. The nightmare scenario is that this precedent extends far beyond Russia. If this logic sticks, maritime shipping enters a dangerous new era, a reversion to the age of privateering, but with state-backed navies. Consider the implications. Every modern commercial ship carries advanced electronics, radar, and communications gear. A hostile state could easily label any merchant vessel as carrying surveillance equipment. Environmental laws are broad enough to justify almost any stop-and-search operation. If you want to seize a ship, you can always find a reason. An oil leak, a paperwork error, a security concern. The line between legitimate security enforcement and economic hostage-taking is blurring, and the rest of the world is watching. China is watching this very closely. They are looking at the Taiwan Strait. They are looking at the South China Sea. If the precedent is set that a regional power can detain commercial shipping under the guise of local law enforcement, that gives Beijing a powerful tool to blockade Taiwan without technically declaring war. Iran is watching. They control the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil flows. They are calculating whether the West actually has the resolve to protect every potential target. We are seeing institutional order collapse, not through a single catastrophic failure, but through the gradual grinding erosion of accepted behavior. The energy markets have already learned the lesson that politicians are trying to ignore. Money is cowardly. It runs from uncertainty. Insurance rates near Russian waters have not just increased. They have spiked to prohibitive levels. Some major insurers in London are pulling coverage entirely for certain routes. This renders those routes commercially dead. A ship without insurance cannot dock in most major ports. Supply chains are fracturing as companies try to price in geopolitical risk. How do you price a cargo shipment when there is a non-zero chance the ship will be seized by a state power? You add a massive premium. That premium gets passed down to the manufacturer, then to the retailer, and finally to you. This creates a strategic nightmare for nations dependent on these logistics. The deepest irony of this entire situation is that the sanctions designed to isolate Russia have actually created the conditions for them to demonstrate a different kind of power. We tried to show them the power of the dollar. They are showing us the power of geography and steel. It is not the power to compete financially. Russia knows it cannot win a banking war against Wall Street. But it is the power to impose chaos. It is the power to force adversaries to operate in a state of permanent uncertainty. This is desperation dressed up as strategy, certainly. But that makes it even more dangerous. A desperate power that feels the rules are rigged against it has no incentive to follow those rules. Russia knows it cannot win by Western standards, so it is attempting to flip the board and change the game entirely. What should disturb us most is not Russian aggression. That is a constant in history. It is our own failure to see this coming. We engaged in a dangerous form of wishful thinking. We assumed we could inflict massive economic pain on a major power without facing physical retaliation. We assumed that because we control the banks, we control the outcome. That was not strategy, that was hubris. Now we are at a crossroads. The global trading system relies on trust and the assumption of safe passage. That assumption has been pierced. Either we negotiate clear boundaries and return to some form of maritime neutrality, or asset seizures become standard practice in the 21st century. Those 12 ships currently sitting in Russian custody are not just vessels. They are markers of a transformation. They represent the moment when the global commons became a contested battlefield. They are proof that the stability we took for granted, the ability to move goods from point A to point B without interference, was always more fragile than we believed. The era of effortless globalization is ending. The era of contested logistics has begun. Stay attentive, stay cynical, and stay engaged, because the determination of whether ships sail freely or sit seized in foreign ports is happening right now, and the outcome will define the economy of the next decade.